The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited today to feature a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Susan Stewart, and she's going to be talking with us about an aspect of being human, of being a woman on this journey that I would say many of us are uncomfortable with, and that is this area of aging, of growing older. And Dr. Susan Stewart is going to share her insights on this stage of life, on this season of life, and the gifts that it can offer us. And along with her insights, which come from different aspects of psychology, including Jungian psychology, depth psychology. There's also research behind this. And so I love when we have this intersection of different sources of information that really help us to take the information and do something with it in our lives. I'm also excited about having Dr. Stewart on today because, the topic or the theme for Women in Depth is conversations about the aspects of a woman's life that are uncertain, unknown, uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and aging definitely fits those categories.
Yes.
Yes. And so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Stewart. Dr. Susan Stewart has been a professor of psychology for over 30 years, now emerita, retired, also a retired therapist and 4 times a grandmother. Susan is passionate about sharing the gifts of late life in a culture that mistakenly equates old age with debilitating decline. Her own journey into the apparent abyss of old age began in 2000, quite by accident and with great resistance, but it has enhanced her view of aging and her life immensely. A series of encounters with the word crone left her unsettled yet curious, and she immersed herself in myths and folktales from around the world, looking for good news about being an older woman. Expecting to find wicked witches and ugly hags like those in stories she heard as a child, she was delighted to discover some very inspiring old women. Audacious, strong, passionate, ingenious, courageous, humorous, wise, and fiercely protective of children and the downtrodden. When she learned that gerontologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and others were describing similar qualities and trends in late life development, she felt compelled to share what she was finding. A professor at the time, she began spreading the word about the underappreciated gifts of age by teaching classes, writing papers, making presentations, and facilitating workshops. And just before turning 70, she completed Winter's Graces, The Surprising Gifts of Later Life. In its pages, she weaves together folktales, current findings in gerontology and other fields, themes from the world's wisdom and spiritual traditions, stories of her own and other older women's experience, and characters from film that reflect late life qualities like contentment, agelessness, simplicity, and necessary fierceness. Susan continues to make presentations and offer workshops on the gifts of late life, many of them specifically for women. She has found that stories, along with recent research, visual images of elders, and the opportunity for participants to reflect on and share their own attitudes and experiences of aging, are a potent mixture. Susan earned a Ph.D. in clinical psychology at age 26 and was a marriage and family therapist for many years. She is blessed to belong to a women's group that has been meeting since 1970. and most were in their 20s at that time, and they are now in their 60s and 70s, and one is in her 80s. Susan is also blessed with 4 grandchildren and 2 grown sons. She is a singer and a cellist and loves to dance. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Lourdes. Good to be with you.
Yes, it's an honor to have you here and to share this conversation and this time. I feel like the topic of aging, it's a loaded subject for many of us.
Yes.
I think it's so important to talk about these things because it's right there, right in front of us, and it's also right there, right beneath the surface.
Yes. It's not one of America's favorite topics.
No, it's not. I would tend to agree with you.
Yeah.
I wanted to start off by asking you about, I guess, your initiation into this, which was your story of the accidental crone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could share that, because I think that's such an important part of what led you to writing this book.
Yes. Yeah, I'd be glad to. I went on what I later learned is called a medicine walk, which is a form of vision quest, but a very small one done in a whole day rather than for days. And we weren't fasting, and we had shelter in a cattle shed once it began to rain. But the idea is we sat in nature and went to a place we felt drawn, and then were to come back and report what happened. And my experience was just kind of odd, I thought. I was 54 at the time. Age was not on my radar. But when I told my story, the facilitator said it was a wonderful crone story. And I didn't really know what he was talking about. I didn't know much in 2000 about crones. I just knew it had something to do with old, and I just forgot about it because it just seemed so irrelevant to my 54-year-old self. And then a couple years later, a grad student of ours mentioned to me, as I was about to turn 56, that in the Celtic tradition, that's the age at which a woman becomes a crone. So it was the second time I was hearing that word. And I have a great fondness, as does Tracy, who told me about the crone for the Celts. So I looked it up in the dictionary, which was a huge mistake. The definition was horrible, and the derivation was even worse. It said a crone is a withered, witch-like old woman, and the word is probably derived from an Old Scots word for carrion.
Oh my goodness.
Which is rotting flesh. And so at that point, I hadn't really started being interested in the crone, but that finished me in my interest. I was not going to go any further. And then, you know how life, sometimes we don't know where we're going. We think we're going to A, and life has a very different plan called Q. And that's what I feel like happened for me. I didn't mean to write a book, and I didn't really mean to study age, but I ran across the word a third time. And in folktales and in life, when something has happened 3 times, it's a really good idea to pay attention. So the third time I read in a random book, it was about Celtic women's spirituality, and the author, Aidan McCoy, told a folktale, or actually an ancient myth, about the crone goddess who had 3 heads and was in the form of a serpent. And in this story, a young warrior with a large sword cuts off one of the heads. And her interpretation was that when the young warrior severed the crone head of the goddess, humankind lost its connections to the endless cycles of birth, life, death, and rebirth. That was really intriguing to me. I mean, those cycles have been very powerful. They just are. I think they're in our DNA. My whole life, that's been of interest to me. So I decided I was going to look into this and just see what I could find. And all I had to go on was the crone was the devourer aspect of the goddess, which was not very heartening in terms of a place to look for good news. But I read myths of goddesses, as everything I could find on old goddesses, as in mature women. And then I went to folk tales, and that's really where I found the stories that you alluded to earlier that were so exciting and heartening and inspiring about what's possible for people, in particular women, as we age. And all of these qualities apply to men as well. It's important to say that. It's just that it was the crone that got me started, so that's how the project evolved.
Wow, what an experience with this word, crone.
Yeah, just a word. I mean, you could be so moved in the direction of your life by a word. It's rather odd, actually. But when I started to find, as you mentioned in your introduction, I started to find research that validated those same qualities. That was really important for me to share. And then at the same time, as I began sharing with some of my friends that I was thinking of writing about becoming a crone, the feedback was really cautionary, like, really? Or, oh, well, good, but just be sure you don't use the word crone. And it turns out they didn't like the word grandmother either. And I was getting really aware of how negative the perception of age is in this culture. And I hadn't really known that so much because I'd never thought or talked about it before. So those two things, running into the stereotype over and over again and finding such a good news, there was such a disconnect between those two. I had to say something. And that's
Wow.
where the book came from.
Now you can see how in that myth where that third head was cut off, that we really are cut off from this aspect of our experience, especially I would say here in the US, as this is not the case in all cultures and all societies. And you noted that in your
Yes.
book. So I was wondering if you can share a little bit about how this beheading of the third head shows up, maybe particularly for women in the US, and also if you can share some contrast with how it appears perhaps in other countries. I'm just curious about that.
Sure. Yeah, well, I would say here, one of the effects, and this is not just here, there was a recent study in Ireland of some 8,500 and something elders. It's a longitudinal, very large study that's been going on. And in their last report, they were talking about the enormous impact that our attitudes toward age have on us. Not only our physical health, but our emotional well-being, how well our brains function, and how long we live.
Wow.
So if our picture is, as it is largely in this culture, negative, the idea is that it's an inevitable downhill slide into misery. It's something we should dread and hide from. That affects all those dimensions of our life in a not good way. Whereas in cultures where elders are respected and have a significant role in the community or the tribe, that has positive effects on all those dimensions. So that's one of the major ways that these views of aging impact elders themselves. And I think also for younger people, there's a tremendous amount of compassion and ingenuity and freedom and wisdom that goes untapped in cultures where age is denigrated because we don't know to look to our elders. And if elders are told that they're over, they've already had their run and they're irrelevant, or worse, that they're a burden, then we don't step forward and even think of offering anything. So I think it not only hurts elders, it hurts younger members of the human family.
Wow, that's really powerful. I am reminded of my grandmother. I'm actually a first generation Filipina. And when I was 5 years old, we were living in an apartment in Los Angeles. So it was very crowded. We were in the city, all that traffic. And my paternal grandmother came to live with us and she moved in with us into this apartment. And I remember she lived with us for a very short time. And, I was 5, so it was kind of, I don't remember a whole lot. I know she went back to the Philippines and she lived to be 104. She would get up before dawn to go out and work in her garden and to fish. And I remember a picture of her where she was sitting kind of like squatting, holding her knife in the garden and looking right at the camera. There was a strength about her. Like, I don't even know if I can squat right now the way she was squatting. But she just had this strength about her. And I remember asking my dad later when I was an adult, how come Lola went back to the Philippines? Because a lot of our relatives, they immigrated here and they stayed here. And I never understood why she went back. And he told me that she had started to get sick and she had never been sick in her entire life. And she was unhappy because in the Philippines and on her farm, she would get up, she had things to do. And she just wanted to go back. She wasn't feeling alive here. She went back to the Philippines, never had any more health issues. And like I said, she lived to 104. In this village, she was revered, she was important, she was necessary. So that's really powerful what you shared.
Quite a story. Sad that you lost her to the Philippines, but I can see why she might have gone back.
Right. Yes. I mean, LA to the Philippines, very
Yeah,
different.
right.
you know.
Yeah. I have a friend who recently told me about her mother. They're American, like long-term, been here a few generations from Norway. And her mother was an art teacher and retired maybe 3 years ago, had really been looking forward to it, and then started to get very depressed and felt like her life was over and it was pointless. She found a couple of places in her community to volunteer as an art teacher part-time, and it's changed everything for her to reestablish a way of being involved and giving something that she's good at and loves that meets a need in the community. So I think it's possible to do that here, even though there's less cultural support than in the Philippines and elsewhere.
Yeah, so it's just beautiful how the way we view aging and the elderly shapes our experience of it as well.
Yes.
So, one of the things I was really interested in is these different dimensions of aging. It's not just about our chronological age. Could you speak about that?
Yes, I taught lifespan development for almost the entire time I was teaching. I started at 26, and it's embarrassing to me now that I was teaching dimensions of any adulthood, but particularly midlife and late life as a 26-year-old. But, they needed someone to teach it, and it was a general ed class, so I got tapped on the shoulder. I actually loved teaching. It was one of the last things I taught at the end of my career also. We used to define age really in terms of chronology, the number of years you've been on the planet. And over time, the vision of age has really changed, where it's now viewed as a multi-dimensional concept. We not only have a chronological age, but we have a biological age based primarily on our physical health. We have an emotional age, which reflects how mature or immature we are psychologically. We have a social age, although right now that is very hard to determine because the social clock, as it's called, is so all over the place. 80-year-olds some are dead, some are still working, some have found a new career. One summer, I had 3 students in my summer school class of lifespan development whose 80-something-year-old grandmothers were all getting married.
Wow.
Yeah, so pretty much social age is less and less relevant, but there are all those other cognitive age, the ways that our brains function. So we now look at age as a multi-dimensional idea, and chronological has really lost its seat of honor, if you will, as the yardstick of how old we really are. It's pretty irrelevant, especially the older we get, the less alike we become with each other. We become more and more who we are, less and less like our age cohorts. So that's something I've seen as a teacher in the textbooks change over time, which has been really an interesting thing to watch, to be old enough and have done something long enough to see how a field has moved over time.
That's really interesting, just how we are not limited by our age. I mean, there's so many aspects to it.
Yeah. And it's very fluid. The sense of how old one is, I think, is very changeable depending on whether we have the flu or we're in a really healthy place, whether there's a lot of stress on our heart and mind or not, what's going on in the world. We're not one age and we don't stay one age either. So there is a gift or a grace of later life that I called agelessness in the book. And it was a very tricky one to articulate because ageless in most people's minds in this culture is a sort of badge of honor reflecting how you're hiding your age very well and you don't look your age. That's what ageless means to a lot of people. But for me, it means being multi-aged, having access to all the ages we've been, including old, and not shying away from any season or feeling like we have to give up young because we're also old, but also not denying age, because it's a beautiful season.
Yeah, this reminds me of the quote that was included with your book. The great thing about getting older is that you don't lose all the other ages you've been.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting way to look at that, that now
Yeah.
you have access to all these other ages.
Yes. We become women of all seasons.
And you can only do that by getting older.
Yeah. I think some particularly unusual young people, especially maybe younger people who've had a life-threatening illness, serious addiction, huge trauma that they've had support living through. Some of us get old emotionally and spiritually and psychologically at a younger age. But I think just the accumulated experience of many decades gives us something that we just can't get any other way other than living a long and full life.
Yeah, it's almost as if the aging process is what frees you to become who you uniquely are.
Yes, well said.
Right. And this reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. One of my mentors, and you actually listed his book at the end of, I think was your first chapter on audacious
Authenticity.
Yeah, it's James Hollis, and he was my mentor through my doctoral process. And beyond, being my advisor, he really was a huge guide and support for me as I navigated that initiation.
It
And
sure is. Yes.
this quote was, "To become a person does not necessarily mean to be well adjusted, well adapted, approved of by others. It means to become who you are. We are meant to become more eccentric, more peculiar. We are not meant just to fit in. We are here to be different. We are here to be the individual." And it seems as if this process of aging is what helps us to get to that place.
Yes, there's a way in which fitting in and pleasing others, which I think is a big message for women in particular, that starts to lose its lure. And it becomes more important being at home in our own skin and being true to who we are. It's not that we don't care about other people at all. It's not that, because in a sense, we get more connected to other people. But in terms of living by collective standards, we get freed up from that in general, I think, as we age, which is wonderful. And I think that one starts in midlife. I don't think you have to wait to be an old woman, just a second half of life woman. He's really talking about second half of life.
Yes, he is. And that's also why I just love this book. I read a lot of books. Well, I love to read them anyway, but a lot just seemed to cross my path. But This was just such a rare topic, first of all, and so beautifully written about and so needed. It was very, very healing, like a balm for me to read this book. And I just want to thank you for that gift. And that's why I'm also so excited to share this with our listeners, because, there are many, many women who, we talk a lot about youth, about mid-age. Also, that conversation has been happening more and more, but really so little conversation about the winter of life.
Yes, it's true. Most of the study of second half of life has focused on the middle part and not the later part. There's some exceptions, but yeah, so thank you. I'm glad the book has had that effect on you. And I didn't think I had a negative attitude toward aging, but I noticed that as I've finished writing this, I actually have a really appreciative view of aging. And I don't think I had that before, even though I had wonderful grandparents and a mom who was quite a human being, even in her 80s. There was kind of a disconnect between my experience of older people in my life and that sort of negative view that hangs in the air and scares us all with fear, the bad things that are going to happen. And the things we're most scared of are not the norm. They don't happen to most people.
I loved how you also noted that a lot of the things that our fears about what we would call old age, the health conditions and being alone, all of these aspects of aging, of not being needed or valued, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or living in a nursing home, which is only about 5% of people. Over 65. And I think the other real boogeyman is severe dementia.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to be reading the literature and then watching, being around people and hearing what they say and watching how people suffer from that fear of any time, like walking into a room and forgetting why you went there
Yeah.
for a moment. That fear of, oh my God, it started, is so pervasive. And the statistics are, I read recently, it's even lower than I thought. So over 65 in this culture, only about 10%, according to ARP. I thought it was more like the high teens, but I had also read that incidents are dropping, which means the vast majority of people do not experience severe dementia. So when we put something in an odd place or forget a word, or what's going on probably is a number of things. One is we process information a little more slowly. So it takes us a little bit longer to find things. And that's just natural. We don't lose it. It's like having a full hard drive. It takes you a little longer to get through the files.
Right.
It's not a big deal. But if we hold the standard of fast as good and slow as bad, then we turn on ourselves. And if we fear it's the beginning of dementia, we really get into trouble, actually tripping ourselves up. It's more likely we haven't slept enough, something is sitting on our heart or our mind, we're stressed out, maybe we're hungry, maybe we need a nap, but it doesn't mean we're destined for dementia. And I just see that so often when I'm with someone who's having a moment like that, and the fear that comes up, it's really painful to watch. It's very understandable, but it's probably not what's going on.
I'm so glad you shared that because that is very common. The elephant in the room for so many and such a huge fear. And there's more written about dementia than other aspects of aging, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. The early studies of aging took place in hospitals with sick elders, and those findings were generalized to the population. So the field of gerontology has been trying for more than 50 years to undo what they now see as the misery perspective that in part came out of early studies that were overgeneralized. It's not the only factor. So there's been far less looking at the good news about growing old, what some of the developmental trends are that enhance our lives and benefit other people's lives. So the ratio of research on bad news is way higher, which is another reason I needed to write this book.
Can you share some of the research behind aging that you think would be really interesting to our listeners?
Sure. One of the biggest surprises to me is that older people are generally happier, which is such a contrast to the misery idea. So there have been a number of cross-national studies done, and Laura Carstensen, who runs the Longevity Center at Stanford, has a really wonderful TED Talk called Older People Are Happier that summarizes some of this research. But the basic idea is in the adult life cycle, starting in young adulthood, going through late life, happiness or contentment follows a kind of U-shaped curve. It's fairly high in young adulthood. It declines in midlife, hits bottom at around 50-ish. That could also be 60, but and then it climbs to new heights in later life. That was really a surprise to me. Even having taught lifespan development, that did not show up in textbooks when I was teaching it. So that's a big piece of good news, I think. And then another area that also was really not in the textbook, but I think is really important, that's kind of a counterpoint to that idea of we come into ourselves and we get a little more eccentric and audacious and free. We also get over ourselves in later life. There's a way in which our personal egoic identity wanes somewhat in importance, and we get, for many older people, a sense of being part of something bigger than ourselves. And some people call that the web of life. Some people call it spirit. Some people call it the human family and the world of species, or whatever you call it. The little I or ego stops being so important. and we have a sense of connectedness to other people and other species that brings a very deep sense of meaning and purpose and responsibility. So I think that's another beautiful part of aging. And in Sweden, there's a gerontologist named Lars Tarnstam that's written about, he calls this gero-transcendence. And gero is old, and
Yeah.
transcendence is stepping over. It doesn't mean we lose our individual identity at all, but it becomes something that's more of an instrument of something more important than our ego. And that is a relief to us and to other people, but also it gives us so much more to work with.
That is beautiful. I love that. Gero transcendence.
Yeah, that's another one that was really surprising. And then there's another piece that I think it's a part of contentment. It's also related to freedom in later life. It's covered in the chapter, The Grace of Simplicity. And it's the idea that in later life, as we become aware we won't be here forever, that has a way of bringing into remarkable clarity what we really value, what we no longer care about, and what is really wasting precious time and energy. And there's a greater freedom to let go of that last category and the less important things, and to really live in terms of our deepest priorities. So there's this permission that arrives in later life as we start recognizing that we're limited in terms of time, and this sense of urgency to make sure that the way we live is in alignment with what we most care about. So there tends to be a paring down of possessions, giving away of things that we just aren't as interested in stuff anymore. And also there can be a letting go of roles we've played, of commitments that are just now, they're no longer alive. They don't feed us, and we're not able to nurture them in the same way. So we get leaner in a sense, and our lives get simpler, and there's enormous joy in that. Living, especially if you're either retired or doing work you really love, it's a wonderful way to be able to live. And so much of younger adult, at least the younger adults I know, are just so stretched in so many directions, needing to work 2 jobs so they can survive in this time and place. And there was a movie years ago called Parenthood, where Steve Martin said something I just thought was so on. He said, "My whole life is have to." And he was, father of 3 and working, and just the things that are part of younger adulthood. And part of the gift of age, I think, if we have the luxury of not working full time, is that we're able to live according to what we really care about. And even if we don't have that luxury, there's a push in us to honor the most important commitments and to let go of the things we can afford to.
So it's almost as if the purpose and the clarity that we spend much of our youth and midlife searching for is a gift that comes with this process of aging.
Yeah, I think it comes to fruition. There's something else, I'm calling it remembrance, but the man who first was aware of it, Robert Butler, called the Life Review. And this is way back from the 60s. He was like, I would say he was the fairy godfather of gerontology. Wonderful psychiatrist, psychologist, beautiful human being. And at the time he was first involved in gerontology, the kind of view of old people is that they sat around and remembered the past and cut themselves off from life and made themselves miserable. And he saw something very different going on, that there is a lot of reflection and a need for quiet and solitude, because we're entertaining memories from childhood, adolescence, our youth. Memories just come back in dreams when we're sitting and being quiet. And the purpose of that is to find the threads of meaning that have run through our life.
Wow.
So that we can make peace with who we are and the life we've lived. And it's a beautiful process. It can be at times painful. We may need to forgive ourselves or forgive other people, let go of some things, look at some events in a different way than we have before. but it's a pretty universal process, this reverie or remembrance or reminiscence or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's part of that coming to fruition you just talked about.
And I wonder too, and this is probably a whole other topic. Yes, it is a whole other topic. That this process of reminiscence or coming to fruition helps us to have a good death, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It helps us to come to terms with our life. And one of the reasons we need to do that is it really does help us die at peace.
That's beautiful.
And it also, I think, it clarifies what we still have to give as a legacy, because that is part of being an elder, is to guide the young, contribute to the culture, and especially in a society like ours where we're taught that we're has-beens and we've done our thing, we're over. We don't tend to think about what we might be contributing. And the elders that I know who somehow resist the stereotype and keep on contributing are just beautiful lights in the community. And I think that's the natural destiny of the elder, is to be a light and to guide and to spread wisdom. And from the perspective of 50 something, 60, 70 years of being an older adult, recognizing that we are all connected, we aren't as alone as we fear we are, and things have a way of working out over time. Not always as fast as we want, but there's usually more to the story than that very desperate, horrible point in it.
In your book, Susan, you use story, you use myth to introduce and to kind of elaborate on these gifts or these graces of later life. There were so many good ones.
There are.
I would love if you can just perhaps share one of the stories and the grace that this story exemplifies with our listeners, to give them a taste of what to expect when they read your book.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I think I would like to tell a story that's actually in the first chapter, which is the one on audacious authenticity and authentic power. So it's not a different grace, but the story's from Algeria. And essentially, it's about a village that was in a very terrible time. They had been surrounded by a neighboring kingdom for months. Half the population had died. The remaining half were ill and starving. And at one point, the mayor brings together the villagers who are there and says, I think the time has come for us to surrender. Maybe if we throw ourselves on the mercy of the enemy, they will show some pity. But if we continue as we are, we will all be dead within weeks, if not days. So the people listen, and they are exhausted. Some of them can barely stand anymore. And they're nodding in agreement, but just with such grief and despair. And then an old woman speaks up. Her name is Aicha, and that's rare in a folk tale that people have names, because they're really about all of us. They're every man and every woman's stories. But Aicha speaks up. She says, I believe that if we have faith, I think I have a plan that can save the village. And the mayor at first is pretty skeptical, because he's a smart man, and he's, I'm sure, thought of a lot of options, and they are quite limited, actually. But he said, well, what do you have in mind? And she says, well, first I need some corn. And the mayor says, well, Aicha, people are starving. Where would we find corn here? She said, I think if we all look, we will find corn. And so the villagers who can go out, and they look high and they look low. And one by one, they come back and find a kernel here, or even a part of a kernel, some of them, and they put it into the bucket that she's holding out. And she praises them. She says, oh, this is so good. She thanks them for their good work, and they're hard looking. And she says, and now I think we just need one more thing. And they're now a little more on board with the plan. And so she said, I need a calf. And they all groan, not just the mayor, because as he says, there hasn't been a calf in this village in months. And she says, I think if we look, we can find a calf. Well, sure enough, it took some time, but at one point, some of the villagers found that a stingy old man had a mangy calf that he'd been hiding in a shed, hoping to sell it for a handsome profit when times got better. And they took it from him. He was not pleased, that they did not care. They brought it to Aicha, and she once again thanked them for their hard work. And then she poured a little water in the bucket and began feeding the corn to the calf. And the mayor was horrified and said, how can you give corn to a calf when we have children who are dying? And she said, have faith. I think all shall be well. So he gave up. She continued feeding the calf. She asked the sentry to allow her to put the calf outside the city gates. The mayor gave permission. She pushed the calf out, and they went back inside. Well, meanwhile, the enemy's been watching this, and they see a calf, and they go grab it, and they bring it back to the king, who's in the encampment surrounding the village, and they say, they have a calf. And the king says, oh boy, well, if they have a calf, they must be doing better than we think. Well, let's not waste the calf. We'll feast tonight and rethink where we are. And so some of the men take the calf off, and it's slaughtered, and they discover undigested corn in its stomach. And they return to the king with this news that this is not only a calf they have, but there's undigested corn. And the king is really alarmed at this point because he recognizes that if they're feeding corn, they have enough food to feed livestock, they're in much better shape than the army is. And so the feast goes on, and the king says, well, we will feast tonight, but by morning we will be gone because they clearly can outlast us. So in the very early morning, the sentry looks out, and in the morning light can now see that the enemy has gone. So he runs through the village announcing it. Aicha is brought to the center of things and praised as the wise woman she is. She's honored for the rest of their days, and the village recovers from the famine and lives in prosperity, and she's honored for the rest of her life. So that's the long version of the story. One thing is that part of audacity, that ability to stand with the self when others are saying something else, like we should give up, and she is willing to take an unpopular stand. And there's also a borrowing from another grace called necessary fierceness, which is courage in dire circumstances. Now, she is basically standing with herself. Sometimes it has a little more fierce aspect to it. The other thing I think it exemplifies is her deep understanding of the human heart, which is a dimension of wisdom. She recognizes there's no rational way to fix this problem. The mayor's already tried that. The supplies are low, dwindling, and there's no help coming. But she's able to think outside the box and use her understanding of human nature and how other people will perceive something. So there's a little bit of that ingenuity and creativity that's another grace of later life, the capacity to find ingenious solutions to important problems that are usually quite non-rational and not ordinary, but they work. And the folk literature is full of those stories. In fact, I think I found more of that kind of story than I found of any other kind. So that exemplifies the grace of ingenuity and creativity. And then there's the way that she relates to the people. She's very gentle and compassionate, which is another grace of winter. In the midst of their suffering, she's very kind and encouraging. Each time they do something, she praises them, and she reveals her plan in a very wise way, rather than saying, well, I've got a plan and outlining the whole thing, which would have been overwhelming. She gives them one small task at a time and gives it to all of them with the knowledge that if they work together, they can do far more than any of them thinks they can do on their own. So I think there's great wisdom and compassion and ingenuity in the way that she sees through this plan and brings it to fruition.
Yes, and there's this sense of gentle but firm standing in who she is.
Beautiful. Yes, exactly.
It's so interesting that you picked that one because I was hoping you'd pick that one, but you
Oh, really? It's one of your favorites too?
Yes, it really
Yes.
is one of my favorites.
Me too.
So that was very interesting and synchronistic.
Yeah.
Susan, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your insight, your wisdom, and helping us to begin to experience and view this part of our human experience in a very different way, a way that involves compassion, gentleness, fierceness, all of these qualities that your book embodies and you also embody. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Lourdes. Thank you.
I would love for you to share the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you, possibly work with you, buy your book.
Yes, absolutely. Well, my book can be had in any local bookstore, and I would urge your listeners to find one there. If the store doesn't have one, they are distributed through Ingram, which only takes a couple of days. So if your store doesn't have it, it could have it quickly. There is an ebook available on Amazon, and that is an option if you don't have a store nearby. But I would urge you to support your local bookseller. And I have a website where I can be contacted. The address is wintersgraces.com. And on that website, there is a way to leave a message and be in touch with me. And there's also an events page which shows upcoming book events, signings, and talks. I've done workshops and will be again, but lately I've been out on the road with the book. So, and I'm based in Petaluma. So I have upcoming events in Santa Rosa, Petaluma, Mendocino, and Seattle that are listed on the website.
Thank you again so much, Susan. It's truly been a gift to spend this time with you, and I'm excited to share our conversation with our listeners. We will be sure to put the information that you've shared in the show notes so that our listeners can find it easily.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lourdes. It's been a pleasure.
Take good care.
You too, dear. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. You can follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. And finally, if you enjoy Women in Depth, please share with a friend. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.